Eleanor had lived in the heart of the same small town for all of her 85 years, never even visiting the next town over. Now she'd emptied her life savings to let her only grandson have an unforgettable wedding. Each penny had been saved from her modest pension, but Eleanor dreamt of the joy it would bring. She pictured the smiles and the laughter, the perfect day in the most beautiful location for her beloved grandson and his future wife. However, as the wedding day approached, everyone was left speechless when the bride said, "She's not welcome." It had come out of nowhere. Everyone was gathered in Eleanor's living room to discuss what Elliot, Eleanor's grandson, and Stephanie, his soon-to-be wife, wanted for their wedding. Eleanor had told Elliot and Stephanie that she would pay for their wedding only a few weeks before, and they had been ecstatic. Yet today, that feeling of euphoria had seemingly shifted as Stephanie turned to Eleanor. "She's not welcome, Elliot," Stephanie stated, as her maid of honor, Megan, stifled a snicker behind her hand. However, that was the only sound heard in the room as everyone but Megan turned to Stephanie with a look of horror on their faces. It was Eleanor herself who broke the tension and the silence by smiling faintly at Stephanie. "That's all right, dear. I'll just be in the kitchen if any of you need me," Eleanor said before she walked out of the living room. Everyone stared after her before turning back to Stephanie, who simply continued discussing the seating arrangements as if nothing had happened. They couldn't believe she behaved that way to Elliot's grandmother. But why did Stephanie not want Eleanor at her wedding? And more importantly, why didn't anyone, especially Elliot, say anything? When Eleanor had told Elliot and Stephanie she'd give them the money they needed to plan a lavish wedding in Italy, she couldn't have been happier. She'd been dreaming of being able to provide her only grandson with something she'd never been able to experience, and was thankful for the perfect opportunity. She could have never guessed what it would lead to. Eleanor had not lived an easy life. She'd been born into poverty, in a big family with a lot of mouths to feed, a father who'd hardly ever been present, and a mother whose heart had hardened by the time Eleanor was born as the sixth in a row of daughters. She learned quickly that they didn't have money for pretty dresses, or new shoes for that matter, let alone to go on holidays like the other girls in town. Even after Eleanor grew up and got engaged to her late husband Theodore, being tight on money had been drilled into her life so well that they'd purchased a modest house to settle down in and had never left it. Their honeymoon consisted of trips to the local beach and dancing several nights in the town's dancing hall. Her world was small, at least that was until her grandson Elliot. She and Theo had also never gone on holidays, and so Eleanor had spent her entire life in the same town. Yet Elliot had traveled to the corners of the world. Every time he returned from a new place, he would bring back a souvenir for Eleanor and show her the pictures he'd taken. It had been why Eleanor had been so excited about the destination wedding in Italy. All her life, she'd only ever seen the sights her hometown offered. The beach was about as far as they ever went, and summer holidays were often spent there or in their backyard. Eleanor had never despised the life she'd lived with Theodore. But when Elliot had shown her those pictures of places all over the world, Eleanor had been looking forward to visiting a new place for the first time in her life. After Stephanie's words, Eleanor made her way into the kitchen to try and compose herself a little. Of course, she'd hoped to attend her grandson's wedding. She'd already written a speech in honor of the boy who'd been her love and joy for the past 25 years. Needless to say, it was a big disappointment to hear that she wouldn't be welcome, but Eleanor decided to set her sadness aside in favor of Elliot's big day. "Grandma," Elliot called from the hallway. Quickly, Eleanor plastered a smile on her face and turned towards her grandson. "Here, love," she said, and pushed a plate of homemade cookies into Elliot's hands before he could say anything. She noticed the confusion on Elliot's face, but ignored it by shooing him out of the kitchen. Eleanor wouldn't let her disappointment ruin the most important day of her grandson's life, no matter how much it broke her heart. Elliot rose swiftly, his chair crashing behind him, commanding the attention of everyone present. "I think it would be best if we could have some privacy," he stated clearly, his voice echoing slightly in the tense room. Reluctantly, the guests began to leave, throwing sympathetic glances towards Eleanor, who retreated further into the shadows of the kitchen, her disappointment palpable in the silent, emptying space. The room fell silent as the last guest closed the door behind them. The sudden solitude amplified the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sounds of the town outside. Elliot's gaze lingered on the door, his mind racing with confusion and hurt. He turned towards Stephanie, noticing her stiff posture and the way her hands clutched at the fabric of her dress, nervously. "We need to talk, Stephanie," Elliot said, his tone firm, yet filled with concern. He approached her, his steps measured and slow. "What happened back there? Why would you say such a thing?" His questions filled the room, seeking to bridge the gap her words had created. Stephanie looked up, her eyes meeting his. Filled with a turmoil she struggled to voice. Stephanie's face was pale, her fingers twisting her engagement ring anxiously. She looked around the now empty living room, feeling the weight of her earlier words hanging heavily between them. "I didn't mean," she started, her voice shaky. "It's just that—" She stopped, unable to find the right words, her anxiety palpable as she tried to gather her scattered thoughts under Elliot's earnest gaze. They sat across from each other, the room filled with the heavy air of unasked questions. Elliot leaned forward, his face concerned, his voice soft. "Please, tell me what's going on," he urged gently. Stephanie avoided his eyes, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She took a deep breath, attempting to explain her unexpected outburst, but the words seemed just out of reach. Elliot tried to keep his tone gentle as the conversation began. "Can you please tell me what's going on?" he asked. Stephanie shifted in her seat, her gaze darting around the room and never settling on his face. She murmured something indistinct, her words muffled and evasive as she picked at the hem of her sleeve, clearly avoiding the heart of the matter. Stephanie's discomfort was palpable. She avoided Elliot's steady gaze, her eyes flicking towards the door as if contemplating an escape. Her speech was halting, her responses to Elliot's questions vague and filled with hesitations. She twisted her engagement ring around her finger, her other hand brushing her hair back in a nervous gesture. Elliot's patience began to wear thin as Stephanie continued to dodge his questions. His voice grew louder, a hint of frustration seeping through. "Stephanie, why won't you talk to me?" he pressed. The tension in the room spiked, the air thick with his raised voice echoing off the walls, Stephanie shrinking back slightly in her chair. Unable to bear the mounting pressure, Stephanie suddenly stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Without a word, she hurried to the door, her quick steps resounding through the now silent room. Elliot stood dumbfounded, watching as she fled the house, her departure leaving a chill of bewildered silence behind her. Elliot moved slowly to the doorway, his eyes following Stephanie as she disappeared down the street. His face was a mixture of anger and sadness, his brow furrowed in confusion. As he stood there, the cold breeze brushing past him, he felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him, none of which he could fully understand or articulate. Eleanor re-entered the living room, noticing immediately the upset look on Elliot's face as he stared out the window. The cozy warmth of the kitchen faded behind her as the chill from Elliot's despair seemed to seep into the corners of the room. She moved quietly, her steps soft on the carpet, sensing the shift in the atmosphere as the afternoon light cast long shadows across the floor. Approaching Elliot, Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her touch was light but filled with warmth, offering a calm presence in the midst of the chaos that surrounded them. Elliot turned to face her, his expression fraught with confusion and hurt, seeking even the smallest comfort in her familiar, reassuring presence. "Elliot, don't worry about me," Eleanor began softly, her voice imbued with a calm certainty. "I'll be all right not attending the wedding. Right now, You need to focus on making things right with Stephanie." Her words were gentle yet firm, pushing him towards reconciliation, emphasizing the importance of resolving their issues. Elliot absorbed his grandmother's words, nodding slowly. The heaviness in his heart didn't lift, but he felt a glimmer of clarity through his emotions. He understood the wisdom in her counsel, recognizing the necessity to confront Stephanie and address the rift her words had caused. Eleanor's steadfast support gave him the strength to think about how to approach the situation. Watching Elliot prepare to leave, Eleanor's face showed traces of deep, quiet sadness. As he opened the door to step out, she turned away, her gaze returning to the now silent home. The soft sigh she let out was barely audible over the faint creak of the door, echoing the solitude that filled the room once more. Elliot grabbed his coat and keys with a determined look on his face. His movements were brisk, purposeful, as he put on his coat and headed towards the door. The keys jingled slightly in his hand as he stepped out, his mind set on finding Stephanie and trying to mend things between them. As he drove through the quiet streets, Elliot rehearsed what he might say to Stephanie. The words rotated through his mind, each sentence crafted and recrafted in hopes of patching up their rift. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching his own determined gaze as he navigated the familiar route to her place. Pulling up outside Stephanie's apartment, Elliot's heart pounded with anticipation. He sat for a moment in the car, gathering his thoughts. With a deep breath, he stepped out and walked up to her door. His hand hesitated for just a second before he raised it to knock, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet hallway. Stephanie opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and relief at seeing Elliot. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. They moved into her living room, the door closing softly behind them. A silent agreement hung in the air as they prepared to talk, both understanding the importance of this conversation. They sat down across from each other, the tension palpable yet underscored by a tentative hope. "I trust Grandma understands," Elliot began, breaking the ice. "I really want us to work through this, Stephanie." His voice carried a sincerity that filled the room, echoing his desire to resolve their issues and move forward together. Eleanor ascended the stairs to her bedroom, each step deliberate as she thought about the day's tumultuous events. Her hand grazed the banister, feeling the smooth wood worn by years of use. Reaching the top, she paused, taking a deep breath before moving towards the solitude of her bedroom, seeking a moment of peace amidst the storm of emotions. Inside her room, Eleanor approached an old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. She lifted the heavy lid with a soft creak, revealing several dusty photo albums stacked neatly inside. Her fingers brushed over the covers, stirring up a swirl of dust motes that danced in the slanting light from the window. Eleanor settled onto the floor, flipping through the pages of the top album. Her eyes lit up as she encountered black and white photos of her and Theodore, young and unmistakably in love. The pictures captured moments of laughter and tender glances, each snapshot a frozen echo of joyful days long past. She paused on a photo of them at the local beach, their honeymoon spot. The image, faded by time, still held the joy of those early days. Eleanor's fingers traced the edges of the photo, the rough texture bringing a surge of nostalgia. She could almost hear the waves and feel the sand beneath her feet as she remembered that blissful time. After a while, Eleanor set the albums aside, wiping a tear that had escaped down her cheek. She gazed around her quiet room, filled with memories and shadows of dreams she had once shared with her late husband. The room felt both full and empty, echoing with the laughter and tears of a life lived fully, but not without its sorrows. The ringing of the phone sliced through the quiet of Eleanor's room, jolting her from her reverie. She reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" she answered softly, her voice echoing faintly in the room. It was Elliot on the other end, his voice rushed and insistent, pulling her further away from the memories of the past. "Grandma, you have to be there." Elliot's words tumbled out, filled with conviction. Despite Stephanie's objections, his tone made it clear that Eleanor's presence at the wedding was not up for debate. He spoke rapidly, his words a firm declaration of his feelings on the matter, leaving little room for argument. Eleanor's voice was calm as she tried to soothe Elliot. "Please, let's not cause more trouble," she pleaded. But Elliot was resolute, his determination not to back down palpable even through the phone. His adamant stance made it clear that this was a battle he was prepared to fight, regardless of the potential fallout. With a heavy heart, Eleanor agreed to attend the wedding. She was worried about the consequences of her presence, yet touched by Elliot's loyalty and determination to have her there. "All right, I'll come," she finally said, her voice a mixture of apprehension and gratitude. The decision weighed on her, but the steadfastness in Elliot's voice gave her a small measure of comfort. After hanging up, Eleanor moved to her window, gazing out at the dimming sky. Her mind was a whirl of anticipation and concern, unsure of what the future might hold. As she watched the colors of the sunset blend into dusk, her feelings mirrored the transition, bright yet overshadowed by the night creeping in. Eleanor carefully packed a small bag, her hands moving methodically as she selected a few essentials for the unexpected trip to Elliot's. Her mind was abuzz with anxious thoughts, each item she placed in the bag a reminder of the uncertainty awaiting her. Despite the unease, she zipped the bag closed, her resolve firming with each click of the luggage lock. With her bag ready, Eleanor dialed the taxi service, her fingers slightly trembling as she pressed each number. Once the call was complete, she took a deep breath and locked her front door behind her, stepping out into the cool evening air. The weight of the door closing echoed her sentiment of stepping into new uncertainties, the familiar click sounding unusually final. Upon arriving at Elliot's, Eleanor was greeted by his attempt at a smile, though the strain behind his eyes was unmistakable. He helped her with her bag, his touch gentle yet fleeting. As they moved towards the living room, the air between them was filled with unspoken words, each step seeming to echo louder than usual in the quiet house. They sat down for a quiet cup of tea, the steam rising in gentle swirls between them. As they sipped, their conversations skirted around light topics, avoiding the more pressing issues at hand. The clink of teaspoons against porcelain filled the brief silences, a delicate soundtrack to their carefully navigated dialogue, neither ready to broach the elephant in the room just yet. As evening fell, Eleanor tried to offer what support she could, her presence a silent pillar of strength in the uneasy house. They moved to the living room, where the fading light cast long shadows across the floor. Sitting quietly, Eleanor's gaze occasionally met Elliot's, each look a wordless exchange of support and shared apprehension about what was yet to come. Eleanor entered the living room to find Elliot and Stephanie mid-argument, their voices loud and faces flushed with anger. They were standing apart, each gesturing animatedly as their words flew like daggers through the air. The intensity of the scene stopped Eleanor in her tracks, her initial intent to greet them forgotten as she absorbed the charged atmosphere. Eleanor hesitated at the doorway, the harsh words slicing through the air and making her feel distinctly unwelcome. She clutched the doorframe slightly, the wood firm beneath her fingers, providing a small sense of stability in the face of the emotional tempest unfolding before her. The vitriol of the argument made the room feel colder, unwelcoming, and far from the family gathering she had envisioned. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Eleanor intervened. "Please, let's calm down and talk this through," she suggested, her voice firm yet imbued with a calm that contrasted sharply with the turmoil around her. She stepped further into the room, her presence like a beacon of reason, but her words seemed to barely penetrate the bubble of anger surrounding Elliot and Stephanie. Despite Eleanor's efforts, the couple's anger seemed undeterred. Their voices continued to rise, the room charged with emotional turmoil that not even her measured tones could soothe. Eleanor's words floated, disregarded, as the argument spiraled, each point they made building the tension higher and pushing resolutions further out of reach. Feeling overwhelmed and helpless, Eleanor retreated to the kitchen, her heart heavy with disappointment. She leaned against the counter, the cool surface a small comfort against the distress she felt. From here, she could still hear the shouts continuing, the sound of their raised voices a stark reminder of the unresolved issues that lay heavy in the air like a thick fog. The argument between Elliot and Stephanie escalated quickly, with Elliot's frustration reaching a breaking point. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping back against the floor with a harsh sound. "Give it back," he demanded, holding out his hand. His voice was firm, his face set in a grim line as he waited for Stephanie to comply, his patience worn thin. Stephanie, tearful and visibly shaken, stared at Elliot for a moment, disbelief etched across her face. Then, with trembling hands, she slowly slid the ring off her finger. She paused, holding it just inches above his open palm, her hesitation palpable. Finally, she let the ring drop, the soft metallic sound it made as it landed seeming disproportionately loud in the tense room. Elliot looked down at the ring in his hand, his expression a complex mix of regret and resolve. He closed his fingers around it, the cold metal a stark reminder of what might be lost forever. This small, heavy band was a symbol of promises made, now potentially promises broken. His jaw tightened as he contemplated the finality of what this moment might mean for them both. The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling heavily on both Elliot and Stephanie. They stood facing each other, the air between them charged with the emotional aftermath of their confrontation. The finality of Stephanie placing the ring in Elliot's hand echoed silently through the space, marking what felt like an irrevocable step towards the end of their relationship. From the hallway, Eleanor watched the scene unfold with a profound sadness. She leaned against the wall, her presence unnoticed as she observed the disintegration of her grandson's engagement. The sorrow for the broken dreams and love lost was palpable, and she felt her heart ache for both Elliot and Stephanie as she silently wished there could have been another way for them. After a moment of heavy silence, Stephanie quickly grabbed her coat and headed for the door. Her movements were brisk, her departure final, leaving no room for further discussion. The sound of the door closing behind her marked the end of an era in the house that had once promised to be her new home. Elliot stood motionless, watching the door close with a soft click. The finality of the moment hung in the air, palpable and heavy. He then turned slowly to face Eleanor, who had watched the scene unfold in silence. Their eyes met, a silent communication passing between them before he even spoke. "She was jealous," Elliot finally said, his voice low and tinged with sadness. "Jealous of how close I am with you, Grandma." He ran a hand through his hair, the strain of the past hour evident in his posture. "It's been an underlying tension for a while," he admitted, his words painting a clearer picture of the rift that had developed. Eleanor listened intently, her heart aching for both Elliot and Stephanie. She understood the complexities of their emotions, the jealousy that had perhaps clouded Stephanie's judgment. "It's hard," she said softly, acknowledging the pain that both of them felt. Her words were few, but filled with empathy, offering comfort in the storm of emotions that had just passed. As they sat together in the quiet house, a new understanding formed between grandmother and grandson. They shared a bond, not just of family, but of mutual pain and compassion for what had transpired. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting gently on Elliot's, a simple gesture laden with love and support as they faced the uncertain future together. In a burst of spontaneity, Elliot suggested, "Let's use the wedding money for a trip. Just you and me, Grandma." His eyes sparkled with the idea of turning their recent woes into an opportunity for joy. Eleanor looked at him, surprised, but quickly warming to the idea of traveling, something she had dreamed of but never realized. Eleanor's face lit up with enthusiasm as she agreed to the trip. "Oh, Elliot, that sounds wonderful," she exclaimed, the possibility of exploring new places igniting a youthful excitement in her. The dream of travel, once tucked away in the corners of her mind, now unfurled into a tangible plan, filling her with an infectious joy. That evening, Elliot and Eleanor spread out maps and travel books across the living room table, their heads bent together in consultation. They discussed routes, destinations, and activities, their conversation bubbling with excitement. The sense of adventure was palpable as they plotted each point on their upcoming journey, turning pages filled with foreign lands and possibilities. The next day, they packed their bags, each item chosen with care for their imminent adventure. As they prepared, their spirits were buoyed by the promise of new experiences. Each folded garment and tucked-away travel guide was a step closer to the trip of a lifetime, a shared journey that promised to lift their spirits and strengthen their bond. As they stepped out of the now quiet house, bags in hand, Eleanor and Elliot looked forward to the adventures that awaited them. The past troubles seemed to dissolve with each step they took away from the familiar threshold, their hearts light with the anticipation of the shared journey ahead, ready to explore the world together.